let's say it out loud. The best days for the Detroit 3 in China have passed. The peak has come and gone. Now they're more or less hanging on as Chinese companies get more and more competitive and powerful. I am Michael Dunne, the author of a book called American Wheels, Chinese Roads. Why did GM really wait until going into China? They looked and looked. 1 billion people without money means we're not going to be selling many cars. So GM steps into China, looks at the competitive environment, looks at government policy and says, we're making a big bet here. It's actually risky, and we don't understand how they're thinking, and I'm pretty sure they don't understand how we're thinking. And that came out very early in the relationship. For example, at one point, the Chinese said, okay, if you step into this joint venture with us, which product are you going to sell here? I know you've done your homework. Which product is it going to be? And the GM guys said, up and down the bureaucratic chain, yes, it's going to be a Chevrolet. And when they announced it's the Chevrolet brand, the Chinese looked at them like, why? No, Chevrolet will never make it here. And the GM folks were looking at each other like, well, if it's not Chevy, what could it be? What brand would work here if not? Chevy's the car for the masses. That's who we're here to serve. And after a pause, the Chinese go, well, no, that's not happening. And the GM guy goes, oh, you want something more prestigious or what? Yes, we do. Oh, you want Cadillac. Cadillac's the one you're after. No, that's too ostentatious, too pretentious. We can't go. No, we're a socialist communist country here. Are you kidding me? And so at that point, GM guys were ready to give up and say, well, we have no idea. There's nothing else in the cupboard. And that's when the Chinese side said, oh, yes. Actually, Buick is the perfect brand for us. And the GM guys couldn't believe their ears and said, Buick? And they said, in fact, if you do Buick, I think this joint venture will really succeed. And in the end, GM goes, not because they understood it, but said, okay, we'll go with it. There was some history. The last emperor of China drove a Buick. Buick brand had been around. People were familiar with the name. But one example of these two big organizations really not on the same page. What GM came to understand about operating in China, and this goes for any foreign company stepping into the PRC, is your first visit is to the government. Now that's completely runs contrary to what we as Americans are used to. Oh, consumer, who's my customer and how can I serve the customer? Well, in China you have two customers. The first is your government at the national level and at the local level. You tell them why you're there, you ask for their support, you get them familiar with your products, and then you receive a blessing from them. And then and only then do you proceed to find a partner and take care of customers. So imagine GM executive coming in, reporting back home and saying, you know what our focus should be in the first 6 months is to talk to the government. The headquarters would say, well, you're wasting time and money. No, this doesn't work. Go and find out who the customer is. Well, meanwhile, especially when GM stepped into the market, the customer was the government. They were the ones buying the cars. So that's a complete rethink or reset for a typical American executive who doesn't speak the language, never lived there, doesn't know the culture, and understands quickly that in order to get anything done, he's got to win favor with the government. China, when GM stepped into the market, was a highly uncertain place with no proven market, a lot of complexity, and the joint ventures that were already operating there were losing money. So GM had every good reason, if it chose to say, you know what, this doesn't make sense. We're just going to lose money like everyone else. Let's get out. Credit in this case goes to the CEO at the time, a guy named Jack Smith, who in retrospect is a real visionary. He said, we're going in, we're going to make $1 billion investment, more than any industrial company had made up until that time, and we're not going to look back. And even after the plant was set up and the cars started to be produced and they weren't selling well, he said, don't worry about it, we're staying in. Why? Well, one thing, he saw something that other people didn't see, and that is a potential for a market. And the other one is he didn't want to let Ford or Chrysler in there. That's always in the back of their mind. There's a fear factor. We'd rather be in than be on the outside looking in. If you look at GM's sales globally right now, there's basically two markets, the US and China. And last year, GM sold more cars in China than it did in the United States. That's how important China's become to them. One way to think about the relationship between China and foreign companies in the automotive sphere is to say who's had the leverage over time. And if we look back in the early 80s when Beijing Jeep was established, the Americans had all the leverage, and they shipped components from the United States, charged a joint venture for those. The joint venture had to pay. They didn't have any negotiating power. If you fast forward to today, the Chinese have the leverage. Not only do they now sit on the largest market in the world, they now produce more vehicles than anyone else. By far, China will produce this year 50% more than the United States. China, from the beginning, has said, what we're interested in is technology. And the foreign companies, from the beginning, have said, what we're interested in is market. And there's been tension for the better part of 30 years where China's been trying to catch up on the technology through these joint ventures, but never really arrived there. As soon as they had mastered one technology had moved on. Something changed, though, in 2010. China became the largest market, surpassing the U.S. for the first time during our during our financial crisis. And China said, hey, we're the largest manufacturer and consumer of cars. We better, why are we following? Why aren't we leading in technology? We don't need to follow anymore. Is there some technology of the future that we can invest in starting now that we'll be the leaders of? And they quickly identified electric vehicles. Around 2015, the government finally said, the only way this is going to work is if we invite people outside of the auto industry, private entrepreneurs into the scene, particularly from tech companies like Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba. And that's exactly what's happened. So now we see the sudden rise of these spectacularly well-designed advanced vehicles that are electric powered, driven principally by tech companies, not by the state enterprises. And this is a totally unfamiliar and new ballgame for global automakers who've forever said, we can keep China a little bit behind because their state enterprises are slow. And they were. Well, wait a second. What about these Googles and Apples and Facebooks of China? What if they're coming at us? So that's a brand new dimension that global automakers are wrestling with and honestly don't know what to do about.